In the previous short lecture, I mentioned that there are essentially three ways to classify contracts. So the first type that we are looking at in this lecture is classification of contracts on the basis of their formation, that is, how the contract came into being, how was it essentially formed originally. So first of all, there are express contracts, those contracts that are formed verbally or in writing, that is by words. So you expressly enter into a contract, that's an express contract. A very simple example is if one person says to another person that he is willing to sell his car to the other person for a certain amount, then in this situation, if the other person replies by informing that yes, he accepts the offer, then in this situation, there is an express contract between these two parties. Next, we have implied contracts, and these are those contracts that are formed by conduct or the action of parties in certain circumstances. So these are to be contrasted with express contracts that we just considered, because implied contracts are essentially those contracts that are implied in certain circumstances. Let me give you a very simple example. So let's say you are standing at the road and you're waiting to cross the road once the lights turn red. In the meanwhile, let's say that a guy comes along and he starts polishing your shoes, and we're presuming that this person is a shoe shiner. And presuming that you don't say anything to this person and you let that person clean your shoes, that is, polish your shoes, then in this particular situation, the very fact that you are not saying no to this person means that you are allowing him to do so. So there is an implied contract, and obviously the implied contract means that you would have to pay him a certain amount of money. Okay, finally we have quasi-contracts, that is constructive contracts, which are basically constructed, that is imposed by the law in certain situations. So essentially the duty, that is the obligation, is imposed by the law itself. And we can also say that quasi-contracts are those that are implied once again, and they're not express contracts, but these contracts, that is quasi-contracts, are implied not by the situation, by the circumstances, but they're implied at law, that is they're imposed by law. Once again, a simple example is going to help you understand this easily. So let's say that a person forgets their goods at somebody's place. Let's say you forget your books at your friend's house. Now in this situation, if your friend goes on to treat those books as her own, then in this situation, let's say she starts highlighting in the books, and she starts taking notes in the books, and pretty much destroys the book. And let's presume that your book was otherwise a very clean copy, and that it was an original book, not a pirated one either, and that you paid a huge amount of money for buying that book. So in this situation, since your friend treated the book as her own when it was actually not her own book, so the law imposed a requirement on your friend not to do so, which is basically a quasi-contract, that is, she was under a duty not to use the book as her own, and now that she has done so, she is going to be bound to pay for the book. Okay, so that's pretty much it about how contracts are classified on the basis of the way they were formed, that is the way they were created, that is on the basis of their formation process. And you can see in each of these three situations, which I'm going to sum up now, that each of these situations discusses how the contract came into being. Now I'm going to very quickly sum up all that I said in this video so that you can compare and contrast these three types, that is express contracts, implied contracts, and quasi-contracts. Speaking of express contracts, first of all, remember that not all contracts have to be written. Some contracts, in fact most contracts, can and are made orally, even if it involves a large amount of money. So in short, an express contract has the terms set down in a very clear-cut fashion, either orally or in writing. However, an oral contract generally is just as binding as a written one. Though of course, needless to say, the terms of a written contract are going to be much easier to prove in case of a dispute in the future. Now, unlike an express contract, the terms of an implied contract are not stated expressly. That is why it's called an implied contract and not an express one. And instead, in implied contracts, the terms are determined from the surrounding circumstances, or, for example, an established pattern of dealings. So speaking of the example that I gave earlier about the shoe shiner, obviously the shoe shiner is not going to be demanding 1000 pounds just for polishing your shoes. So the terms of this particular kind of implied contract are going to be determined, that is the price element is going to be determined on the basis of the previous experiences of shoe shiners. That is, it's normally not going to exceed a very small amount of money that is usually given in most areas in most countries. Okay, so hopefully you're clear about the difference between express and implied contracts and the fact that both of these are formed differently. Quasi-contracts, that is the last one that we're discussing in this lecture, are once again contracts that are implied at law, and they exist usually because of the fact that the law considers that even in the absence of an express or implied contract between two parties, it is still considered reasonable to impose an obligation on the parties. Why? Because it's going to be unjust that one person gets enriched at the expense of another person. So once again, to look at an example, let's say that you forget your wallet at your friend's place and your friend decides to use the money that is inside the wallet. Now in this situation, once again, there is a quasi-contract, that is a contract implied at law. And please don't confuse implied contracts, that is the second category that we just discussed, with the third one, because the second category, like I said earlier, are implied contracts, that is contracts implied by circumstances, whereas the third one are a kind of implied contracts, but these quasi-contracts are implied at law and not by circumstances. So quasi-contracts are best looked at as constructive contracts because the law constructs a contract in certain situations. And these are not those kinds of contracts which are implied by conduct or the action of parties the way implied contracts are. So quasi-contracts, just to give one more example before I conclude this lecture, can also be seen in medical emergency situations. So for example, often people who find themselves in accidents are not in a position, maybe they are unconscious at the time that they're being taken to the hospital. So obviously when a person is unconscious, they are not in a position to give their express or implied consent. So please be very clear about this, that this kind of a contract is a quasi-contract and not an implied one. Why? Because you're not expressing your agreement to be taken to the hospital even by your conduct or action, because when you're unconscious, you're not going to be able to imply anything, far from obviously expressing anything. And in this kind of a situation, when you are taken to the hospital and the doctor saves your life by giving you the required medical emergency treatment, so in this situation, obviously the law is going to impose a requirement, that is an obligation on you to pay the hospital, to pay the doctor. Why? Because regardless of the fact that you did not give your express consent or even an implied one, the law is going to find that a quasi-contract exists and would force payment of a reasonable value to the hospital for its services.